Hello! Melanie and I are going to do a reading today from After the Referendum, Where Egos Dare. This reading comes from Chapter 22, a phone call between Rupert and Richard. Melanie.
Thank you. Breaking the habit of a lifetime, Rupert had thought ahead. He tried to plan what he should say to Richard. He knew he had to get the brute to stab the Prime Minister firmly in the back if he, Rupert, were to have a chance of snatching the prime ministerial crown from the corpse of June Grey.
Rupert had to play his cards carefully, as he knew Richard could not be intimidated. Richard did have one weak spot, however. His self-importance was legendary.
Rupert considered himself a dab hand at flattery. Time to put his know-how into practice.
Richard, old boy, how are you? And might I say, what a superb performance on Question Time last night. You had me applauding in my armchair as you ripped hapless, hopeless Morgana to shreds. One of the most elegant demolition jobs I have seen in some time.
Rupert oozed bonhomie. Richard could not help but be pleased. Foreign Secretary, how nice to hear your voice. Thank you, you are too kind. I feel much of the credit must be at your door, since I borrowed heavily from the Watson textbook.
Richard wasn't half the public speaker that Rupert was, but in private he was more than capable of holding his own. They were an evenly matched pair. As they found themselves on the same side of the most important debates of the day, they formed a tacit alliance, teaming up to destroy their common enemies. The pact, however, was as fragile as each man's ego, a fact they both sensed from the outset. They knew that without the essential common adversary, they would turn on each other.
That day lay in the future, as there was the small matter of the wounded but still upright woman in their way to deal with. On this, they came at the question from different positions. Richard feared that June, despite all his support and guidance, would block, or more likely fudge, the clean exit that he desired, whereas Rupert simply wanted her job.
Rupert's laugh was fruity. Well, I'm sure that cannot be the case, Richard. Anyone who knows me would attest I have far too little patience to write anything as dull as a textbook. I managed to get through most of my school years without even reading one, come to think of it.
Rupert sniggered, pleased to be starting the conversation off on such a good note. Mobile telephones were excellent. They enabled such movement and spontaneity. Maybe he should reward himself with a snack. Clutching his phone like a baby his blanket, Rupert wandered off into the kitchen like a bear about to ransack the bins.
Richard grimaced, silently cursing his rival's life of privilege and his utter obliviousness to the lives of other people. Richard could identify with the dullness of textbooks of any form, and would have jumped at the chance to get someone else to do his homework, but it was not money that had rained down on Richard from the hands of his father.
Rupert's eyes lit up, as they usually did when he espied a refrigerator. He caressed the smooth white exterior, so reassuringly familiar, and continued. Anyhow, as you have probably guessed, I'm calling about this meeting that June has called. I take it she has been in touch.
Indeed she has, Rupert.
Richard decided to let Rupert make the running.
Excellent.
Rupert had a sudden doubt. Richard was the unlikely crutch that June had been leaning on for the past few months. Was it too much of a risk to open up to him? He decided to exert uncharacteristic caution.
I think it is most courageous, and may I say bold, for the PM to invite the opposition. In a situation like this, we need to marshal all the talents and get the best ideas out, as she says herself. I think this could be quite a decisive moment for Czechsit.
Rupert stopped, partly to let Richard respond, partly because he found it hard to mouth such balderdash without choking. He was itching to say something horrid about June, or about the other non-entities that would be in attendance. Maybe he should have a quick bite to eat, to keep his mouth from getting him into too much trouble.
He opened the fridge door. A plate of innocent chocolate eclairs lay in its chilly depths. How utterly fulfilling! Rupert grabbed one and shoved it into his mouth whole before he could blurt out what was running through his head.
Fortunately for Rupert, Richard was still irritated by the conversation he had just had with June. So his sarcastic laugh echoed out of the phone.
Quite, Foreign Secretary, quite. I've just had June's attempt at a motivational speech. Her plan is to repeat her platitudes until everyone else gives up in desperation and agrees with her plan. The only problem is that she doesn't have a plan. It's going to be a resounding success. Oh, and I have been awarded the role of school prefect and will be handing out 50 lines to anyone who dares to disagree with said non-existent plan.
Richard narrowed his eyes. Once again, his addiction to belittling someone had blasted his caution to smithereens. Never mind. Rupert surely wasn't stupid enough to have thought he approved of June's policies, and moreover, he clearly felt the same way himself. Besides, it felt so good to say it, a warm glow like a fine scotch sliding down him, shaking his thirst for derision and putting people in their place. Life would be no fun at all if he had to deny himself his barbs and his bullying.
Rupert felt the same way about food. Although he was slightly taken aback by Richard's acid candour, the sweet explosion of choux, cream and chocolate in his mouth was his sole point of focus. Like a screaming child on an aeroplane, it was impossible to ignore and drown everything out. There were 3 more eclairs. 3 more delights were making eyes at him from inside the fridge. They wanted him. They truly did. It was all the most natural thing. He had to have them. Doubtless, Susan had bought them for some occasion or other, but Rupert was simply incapable of caring about that. His hand was reaching for a second before he had even finished swallowing the first one.
Rupert, are you still there?
Rupert's hand dropped. With uncharacteristic control, he backed off and shut the fridge door. With sadness and regret. Curses! He had to focus. He managed to swallow most of the eclair, and his diction was only slightly inhibited by the remainder.
Of course I am. I was just digesting what you said, that's all.
Rupert thought about his next move. He should continue to tease out Richard's position before making his own proposal. That was the smart option. But that could take time. And those eclairs weren't going to eat themselves. It would be far quicker to just stick the knife in and get it all over with.
As he so often did, Rupert followed his gut. He spoke up. Richard, my point is this. We have all been trying to navigate to this non-existent middle ground that allows June to say she has obeyed the majority of the voters whilst doing as little as possible, which simply annoys everybody else. Accordingly, we have been failing dismally because, by its very definition, the middle ground in question cannot exist. Standing ever so firm and simply willing it to happen doesn't work. June is like some modern-day version of King Canute. She refuses to bow to reality and appears to want to remain half pregnant with Chexit forevermore. Do you know, she said, "Where there's a will, there's a way," to me the other day. Christ on a bike, what utter poppycock! I'm beginning to think she is actually just too thick to understand the fundamentals of the situation.
It seems once again, Rupert, that we have similar views, drawled Richard. The question is, what is to be done?
The two men were silent for a moment. Rupert was attempting to banish the persistent image of the plate of remaining eclairs, while Richard was loosening the waistband of his thong so that some discomfort ensued.
They both needed to think. Rupert was first to speak.
Sadly, I think we have to start considering a post-June regime if she is unable to make any further progress. We should be utterly uncompromising in this meeting, insisting on the purity of our position. It is ideological, for heaven's sake, and if we do not fight for it, then who will? She will either support us, or she will do her usual shilly-shallying. In that case, we must make our objections heard most forcefully. In either case, the meeting is likely to collapse in farce, and dear June will be fatally wounded.
I can do that, replied Richard. What comes next?